It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Asao Inoue. Asao is Professor of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences and the Director of University Writing and the Writing Center at the University of Washington, Tacoma. His scholarship on writing assessment, race, and racism has received numerous prestigious awards. His article, Theorizing Failure in U.S. Writing Assessments, won the 2014 CWPA Outstanding Scholarship Award. His co-edited collection, Race and Writing Assessment, won the 2014 4Cs Outstanding Book Award for an edited collection. His book, Anti-Racist Writing Assessment Ecologies, Teaching and Assessing for a Socially Just Future, won the 2017 4Cs Outstanding Book Award for a monograph and the 2015 CWPA Outstanding Book Award. While this is all impressive, what is more impressive is the way that his scholarly work encourages us all to challenge institutional racism embedded within our practices. Given today's political landscape, there is perhaps no better moment for us to take up that call and consider how we can create more inclusive and equitable classroom spaces. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Asao Inoue.
Well, thank you, and I'm so happy to be here. I appreciate your hospitality, and I've already had some nice conversations already this morning. So I will get started. Welcome to the talk, Changing the Rules of the Grading Game, or How Can We Assess So That People Stop Killing Each Other? I don't know if I'm going to be able to live up to that title, but I'm going to try very hard. I'm honored and grateful to be here today and offer you something. I would like to thank Dr. Zobel and Graziano and Cassidy for inviting me, making arrangements, and everyone else who organized my visit to your wonderful university. It's nice to be here, as I used to live in Monmouth years ago. This place has a very warm place in my heart. I also feel compelled to make a land acknowledgement before I begin. I wish to thank and I'm probably going to get some of these names wrong, my apologies, the Kalapua, Malala, and the Chinook indigenous peoples who lived on this land around Monmouth and in the Willamette Valley long before white colonial settlers came. We are all in their debt, and I am saddened at the ways in which our government and the people of this area in the past have treated them. What I offer today is a discussion of why we must change the rules of the grading game in literacy and writing classrooms. I will discuss this in 3 parts. I'll begin by arguing that literacy education at all levels in the U.S. has and continues to function as white racial property. Then offer a connection to my own life and literacy learning in school. And finally, I'll consider how changing the rules of the grading game in classrooms may have larger implications to society. That is, can changing how we grade stop people from killing each other? When grading is done well in writing and literacy classrooms, it offers opportunities to address the politics of the judgment of language, which is vital in negotiating any rhetorical situation in and out of school. Some call this critical pedagogy, but I think the minute teachers move to pedagogy, to teaching, to lessons and readings, most of us ignore or forget about assessment and grading. Or maybe many of us feel that the grading part of a course can be separated from the learning part or the critical part. I mean, most of us don't grade first drafts anyways, right? But that isn't enough if we wish to not be unfair. I mean, if we want to be anti-racist or offer more equitable assessment conditions in our classrooms and schools, it is often believed falsely that grading is just an institutional necessity, something we can ask students to ignore, at least while they are learning. But to attempt to do this is to ignore the way grades work in classrooms, how they shape many aspects of the entire ecology, how they influence students and teachers' actions. Not thinking of assessment first, or at least simultaneously with pedagogy and curricula, is a mistake. It leads to inequitable and unfair classrooms. What I'm called us today is to change the rules of the grading game. Put simply, stop using so-called quality or a single standard to grade student writing. The goal of the kind of classroom assessment ecology I'm calling for is one that makes the means of grading also its ends. Use labor, for instance, to determine grades, not so-called quality in your classrooms. That's it, really. That's all I'm asking for. At the end of the day, our students' processes of learning, their labors, are all they have and all they can have for their learning. I know this seems really hokey and undoable. It sounds like some permissive new age, everyone can just be who they are and that's okay kind of philosophy for grading literacy performances. And maybe it is. But maybe, given what literacy really is in the world, how it moves and changes, circulates in communities, how plural it is, how all instances of discourse are equally communicative, how dominant standards in all schools become so because of who gets to make such rules, maybe using labor instead of your idiosyncratic sense of what is best or right or correct language use in your classroom is truer to what literacy is and offers students more than a standard. Maybe letting multiple ways of languaging in a classroom exist, really exist, in the structures of that ecology, not just in our promises to students about their rights to their own language, can offer students critical distance and access to the politics of language and its judgment in our world. Critical distance to the dominant standards too often imposed on them through grading. And maybe using labor to grade is a fairer and more socially just grading practice than one that uses a single standard to judge so-called quality of our diverse students' writing, for instance. Maybe we can change the rules of the grading game by using labor and not a standard, while allowing multiple standards to exist in the classroom also. Okay, let me back up and explain. I know that most teachers who assign writing hate grading it. And you know intuitively how bad it is for your students' learning, the grading part. It's a distraction that pulls students away from the real dialogues and discussion about their writing that we want to have with them. It isn't formative in nature. A grade on a paper is a red herring to most students. But there is a more sinister problem with grading, one that may make some of you uncomfortable because it is going to sound like a personal attack or a reason to be permissive and lax about our standards. Standards you likely hold dear, standards that are a part of you and are the keys to the academic and civic kingdoms, or so you think. It may even sound like a way not to prepare our students for future success with language. What I'm about to say may sound like I'm setting up the least prepared students in our classrooms for spectacular failure down the road. I want to assure you that this is far from what I mean and far from what I've seen in my own classrooms that use only labor to calculate course grades. What I'm about to say, I say from a compassionate and caring heart, teacher to teacher. I know your intentions are good, but intentions ain't enough in the structurally racist world we live in. So what is this more sinister problem with grading? Grading is a racist and white supremacist practice. There's no way around it. Grading is almost always employed in order to do three kinds of things: control students, and sometimes our teachers, force students to be accountable, and sometimes our teachers, and measure or rank students, and sometimes our teachers, either against each other or against a single standard. Each of these purposes for grading in classrooms is detrimental to learning generally and more harmful to many students of color and racial-linguistically diverse students who come to our classrooms with habitus or linguistic and bodily and performative dispositions that do not match the white racial habitus embodied in the standard of the classroom. In short, the traditional purposes for grading writing turn out to be de facto racist and white supremacist because of the dominant white racial habitus that already informs the standards by which all teachers use to grade their students, that they learn in their disciplines. Why do you really think we must control, make accountable, and measure our students? Because most do not fit the white racial middle class habitus that we use as the standard, the dominant discourse. Let me make very clear about one thing. In our current society and educational systems, regardless of who you are, where you come from, or what your intentions or motives are as a teacher, if you use a single standard to grade students' language performances, you are directly contributing to the racist status quo in school and society. Why? Because language only moves in groups of people, and people are racialized in a variety of ways in society and history. Groups of mostly white males created our school systems and academic disciplines that train teachers at all levels. Those men learned their language from other white men and women. Literacy education in the US is a white institution because the language norms and standards that moved with those who created and currently maintain those systems embody a white racial habitus, even if they are not racially white or have white skin privilege. This is how language exists and how race is a part of our politics of language. While linguists and other scholars agree that there is no single way to communicate effectively, judgments of effectiveness and correctness of language are contingent and contextual. White people and whiteness as a set of racial linguistic dispositions and habits, or white habitus, are the context and contingency for goodness, or appropriateness, or excellence in writing in schools and most of society. This means all standards for good writing are deeply informed by a white racial habitus. This makes grading by such standards white supremacist. I'm not saying that you, the teacher, are a bad person or are racist, but by grading by a standard, it does make your grading methods and your grading ecology in your classroom racist and white supremacist. So sit with that for a moment. I hope it makes you uncomfortable, because that's the only way you can grow, change, and perhaps find more socially just solutions. I've argued elsewhere how this is the case, so I won't rehearse those arguments today. Instead, I point to the legal literature on the history of whiteness as property in the US to further argue the point that grading by a single standard is white supremacist, which should urge us all to change the rules of the grading game. Cheryl L. Harris's comprehensive legal account of the ways that laws and the courts in the US defined and maintained whiteness as property extends to education and literacy, particularly as in the Brown v. Board of Education decisions of 54 and 55, which were an extension of the Plessy v. Ferguson decision of 1896. These judicial decisions hinged on questions of whiteness as property. Harris explains in her conclusion about Brown's decision, whiteness as property continues to perpetuate racial subordination through the court's definitions of group identity and through the court's discourse and doctrine on affirmative action. The exclusion of subordinate others was and remains a central part of the property interest in whiteness and indeed is part of the protection that the court extends to whites' settled expectations of continued privilege. What Harris shows in her discussion over and over is the way whiteness has functioned and been used as property for the benefit of those deemed to be racially white at the time. Whiteness is the property that even a poor, uneducated, or jobless white man can have that has value. Furthermore, Harris argues that, quote, whiteness and property share a common premise, a conceptual nucleus of the right to exclude. Whiteness as property is therefore about exclusion. This point is critical in educational settings because all of us proclaim or promote inclusion. Our schools, programs, even pedagogies proclaim to include racial linguistically diverse students. But our grading practices, standards, and assessment assumptions function to exclude. And the direction that this exclusion takes is a racialized one. In Literacy and Racial Justice, The Politics of Learning After Brown v. Board of Education, Catherine Prendergast argues convincingly that historically in the US, the courts have worked from a fundamental premise that, quote, literacy is first and foremost white property. She looks closely at the logics and consequences of Brown v. Board of Education, Washington v. Davis, and the Regents of University of California v. Back, all of which demonstrate what Prendergast calls, quote, the economy of literacy as a white property, or a dynamic rooted in a figurative or literal white flight in places where people of color begin to accumulate. She explains this dynamic this way. Literacy standards are perceived to be falling or in peril of falling when too many people of color, often African American and Latinx, are included or present in the place in question, be it a school, a police department, a community, etc. Where do we find the most calls around literacy crises? Schools and community colleges that are made up of increasing numbers of people of color. What do schools and classrooms have at their disposal to remedy such perceptions of falling literacy standards among their students? Grading mechanisms and standards. Remember, the primary goals of grading by a standard, and this includes placement and other large-scale assessments, are control, enforced accountability, and measurement. Thus, grading is a great way to protect the white property of literacy in schools while never mentioning race. It's a great way to maintain the white supremacist status quo without ever being white supremacist. The red marks and grades on papers and assignments that signal how white a literacy performance is or seems to be is the redlining practice of the academy. So, if literacy has been and continues to be a white property in the US, and if the nature of white property is the right to exclude, and if grading by a standard is always about control, accountability, and measurement, then grading by a single standard is how most, if not all, schools and writing classrooms exercise the historical right to exclude in order to protect literacy as white property. All the while exclaiming and even believing that we, teachers, are helping our students of color. And how well has that helping really worked so far? Put more directly, in all schools, grades of quality are the measures of discrimination, the methods of exclusion, not inclusion. Therefore, we must change the rules of the grading game in our classrooms so that our grading mechanisms stop trying to be fair to everyone. In other words, stop trying to treat everyone as if they're white and start trying not to be unfair, not to be white supremacist, which is the default of the system. This latter purpose for grading ecologies in classrooms stems from an assumption that the literacy practices promoted in schools and colleges have and still are conceived of as white property, and that the standards and grading practices we all inherit in our disciplines, or that are forced upon us by principals and disciplines, departments, and programs, are white supremacist and function to exclude, not include, despite most educators' good intentions. I'm reminded of the noted eugenicist and advocate for racial segregation, Lothrop Stoddard, and his 1920 book, The Rising Tide of Color, The Threat Against White World Supremacy. Stoddard was a white supremacist. In the book, he argues that increasing populations of people of color around the world threaten the white geographic, economic, and political center. White settlements are being taken over, he argues, by various peoples of color. And this is a bad thing, he says. Strategically, Stoddard notes, there are inner and outer dikes. The outer dikes of civilization are those places in the world that contain mostly people of color. But the inner are those places on the globe that are white settlements in which people of color are increasing, and those areas must be protected. Just like the logic behind redlining to protect real estate property from Black Americans in the US, the white settlements, the white property that Stoddard speaks of are understood as critical inner dikes that need protecting because they are the last defense of the white centers of property. Education, schools, and literacy in general in the US are inner dikes that literacy teachers of all stripes too often protect from the rising tide of students of color. Stoddard's introduction to this description is instructive in how it so easily maps to arguments about raising standards and literacy crises today. He captures the same basic logic. He says, the inner dikes, the areas of white settlement, however, are a very different matter. Peopled as they are wholly or largely by whites, they have become parts of the race heritage, which should be defended to the last extremity, no matter if the costs involved are greater than their mere economic value would warrant. They are the true bulwarks of the race, the patrimony of future generations who have a right to demand of us that we shall be born white in a white man's land. Ill will it fare if ever our race should close its ears to those most elemental call of the blood. There is no more fitting analogy to grading by a standard than Stoddard's description of inner dikes. Schools, colleges, and universities today are literally and figuratively white settlements, many built on land stolen from indigenous peoples, which have become tacitly, as Stoddard makes clear, a white settlement, an inner dike to protect and pass on to the next generation. While our terms may be less overtly racialized today, we still talk and think of schools and universities as true bulwarks for standards, or as the centers of literacy promotion, which is the white property of those settlements. In Stoddard's terms, this makes educational institutions the race heritage of each generation, or the patrimony, to be passed on to the next generation. And that generation is racially white by this logic. This makes grading by a standard, again, the method for protecting and cleaning out the inner dike, whitening it. In short, schools are the inner dikes of literacy as white property. Grading is the gun and bayonet, which are used against all students to cleanse them, to whiten them, or drive them out. Again, the rules for grading must change if we wish to stop trying to whiten the dike. When we change the rules for grading dramatically, for instance, as when one stops using a standard to grade student performances, we realize that we must choose something else to use to determine final course grades. This makes us mindful of our assumptions about grading, mindful about what we assume a paper or written product demonstrates to us about a student, mindful of where those expectations come from, mindful of what we think we can see and what textual markers we use that makes present so-called quality in a draft. It makes us mindful that we use a standard of our own and not someone else's, a standard that comes from some group of language users who are racialized already, and that we do not use something else to calculate grades, like labor or effort or engagement, which arguably are better measures of learning and future success. When we are mindful that we grade in particular ways, we have a better chance to pay attention to details about our own practices and how they have happened. We have a better chance not to simply whiten the dike. Using labor-based grading contracts, for instance, requires, even encourages, this kind of mindful attention because the rules of the grading game are so dramatically different from conventional standards-based ones. Now, let me shift gears to the personal. This is a kind of counter story to education by standards. If I'm going to argue that your grading practices depend on your racialized white habitus, then mine do too. Next slide. I realize also the oxymoronic haunting whiteness, as Kennedy, Middleton, and Radcliffe would say in my own discourse in my classrooms and here today. This is part of the problematic of writing assessment that led me to changing the rules of my grading game to labor-based grading contracts. My own brand of code-meshed English, like everyone's, is a product of my history in schools and growing up in poor, Black, and Latinx working class areas in Las Vegas. I left those discourses behind, or so I thought. The discourse from the academy, the white middle class discourse I worked so hard to take on, seemed to give me access and opportunities that I likely wouldn't have had otherwise. But if I'm really honest, my own striving for the dominant English I currently practice started with an impulse not to be poor, not to be seen as stupid, not to be brown, not to be pushed out of the outer dikes of the US. I thought I wanted to be white. White meant smart. And this was the lesson that all of my writing assessment ecologies taught me in school. It was the lesson I got from the grading of my own writing. You see, I was raised on Stat Street in North Las Vegas, the so-called bad part of town, the black part, a city created by banks' redlining practices. Everyone in my neighborhood, except for one college-age neighbor, my brother and me, were Black. We lived in roach-infested, government-subsidized housing. By the latter years of elementary school, we'd moved to a white working-class neighborhood on the edge of several Latinx communities in the southeast part of Vegas. We moved from an outer to an inner dike. All the while, following the carrot of economic success and the promise of upward mobility, and upward mobility that was easier for us than our Black neighbors on Stats. But easier did not mean easy. We were never really accepted in the new community. Inner dikes are socially engineered to whiten themselves automatically. Our new white working class neighbors in Pecos Trailer Park explicitly told us on many occasions, often whenever they had the chance, that they didn't want people like us living there. They didn't want us brown folks in the trailer park, although they used worse language than that. But I was determined in all the senses of that word can mean, I'm thinking Marxian determination, to stay just long enough to leave, to move in the system of dikes. What was required was school, learning, literacy, the dominant English. This meant good grades. I didn't understand how docile this made me in school. I didn't understand the internal colonization. I didn't understand how grading by a single white standard in all those classrooms of my youth were sending me one message: be white or be gone. You are not really good enough. I loved getting good grades in school, I won't lie. but I hated how I had to get them. It was like lying every day until the lies became me, until I couldn't tell anymore what was a lie and what was me. While I've gained much from taking on a version of the dominant white habitus, I've also given up or forgotten much of my own working class, ghetto, African American English that I began my schooling with. The aspects of my own habitus that I accentuate in my classrooms and scholarly work now are ones of growing up half Japanese and working poor, and of having a mom who would say she is white, but I'm not convinced she fully believes it. We have Greek, English, and Scottish ancestors on her side. My mom is not fair-skinned or fair-haired, but fair enough to pass or to be white in the US. I never was. And yet, she never got a college degree, was single most of my childhood, and worked 3 jobs so that I could be poor. She would say to me, get good grades, do the extra credit. No one asked you how you got your A. A B student is an A student who didn't apply himself. She was telling me to labor, to work. She was telling me to make them judge me by my labor. My mom is smart, detail-oriented, and beautiful in her work ethic. She led by example. She labored every day to exhaustion without complaint, often collapsing on the couch late at night. I love my mom, and she always showed her love to me. But she was also stern about grades in school, sometimes to the point of unfairness. I know it was because she didn't want me to do what she had to do, to work and work and work and still never have enough money or clothes or food or time with her family. The biggest lesson I took to college and career from my mom was a simple motto. I may not be the smartest guy in the room, but I damn well will be the hardest working one. In college, I made sure I did more work than anyone else. What I realize now is that I slowly, over the years, turned this motto into a pedagogy, then an assessment practice, which would become labor-based grading contracts. What I also realize now is that I got the first part of my motto wrong. To be judged the smartest guy in the room means that there's a single standard to judge what smart means. That standard has always been a white racial habitus, a white discourse. So of course, by definition, I literally cannot be the smartest guy in the room. I cannot be a white guy speaking well, to alter the words of Quintilian. Then there was a point in my adult life when I stopped trying to deny the habitus of my upbringing, the language of the streets of North Las Vegas. And I moved to retain enough of the old discourse to use as a critical optic and phonic apparatus as a way to look and listen for the haunting whiteness around me and in me. This ability to deny black discourse and adopt a white discourse is a white privilege I know I have, one I must acknowledge and interrogate constantly. I ain't proud of leaving my language of my nurture behind, or trying to, a paradox in the problematic, especially when I meet students today who language the way I did back then, when my own feedback on their language pressures them toward a white racial habitus. Then again, I ain't all white middle class habitus. I often draw on this in my languaging with students, another paradox. I claim my Japanese heritage, my dad's family, despite growing up not knowing him at all, another paradox. My mom is Scottish, English, and some Greek. Imagine that. A Japanese American, usually mistaken for Latino, who started in life speaking African American English, living in African American communities, yet speaking mostly standard white middle class English now, and raised by a poor working class mom who sees herself as white. Paradoxes. Like everyone, I code mesh. What I say now is code mesh. My work and the labor-based grading contracts is a part of coming to terms with my own intersectional, racialized, educational, and linguistic history. Knowing these things about me may help you understand just how many grains of salt you should take with what I offer today. It should also suggest the ways I honor labor and how deeply I have felt its importance in my life, classroom and scholarship, how it was literally all I had in school. And so labor-based grading contracts form a part of my social justice agenda in my classroom's anti-racist writing assessment ecologies. This agenda means I try to create conditions that allow for my writing classrooms to question meaningfully the white racial habitus, the standards that determine in the Marxian sense, as in creates boundaries and applies pressures in a particular direction, standards for the judgment of writing, and expectations teachers and others have for their languaging. I want my students to have real choices in their labors of languaging? And how do I do this work knowing that my classrooms are always already situated in larger societal institutional ecologies that determine much of how my students act in my classroom? Their languages will be graded next quarter or semester. How do I help them through that? By changing the rules of the grading game, valuing labor over so-called quality, in order that we might interrogate the nature and politics of judgment, all the while practicing reading and writing with more confidence, without ranking that comes with grades and numbers. Finally, let me turn one more time to a larger social justice work outside of our classrooms that I hinted at in my opening. How do we assess writing so that people stop killing each other? Can changing the rules of the grading game help us do this? I take this idea from Mary Rose O'Reilly's invocation of this question that she gets from Ihab Hassan. In the short 1989 article in which O'Reilly offers the question, she ruminates on her teaching life to that point, which began in the 1960s. She asks, how did I get here? And invokes Jerry Farber's infamous article and book, The Student as Inward. In Farber's book, he describes students as slaves, and grades are central to their slave-making docility. While I have some problems with the slave metaphor, the point of grades as docile-making, I think, is accurate. Here's Farber's description, which helps us see and hear the exigence that O'Reilly is calling on. He says, what school amounts to, then, for white and black kids alike, is a 12-year course in how to be slaves. What else could explain what I see in freshman class? They've got that slave mentality, obliging and ingratiating on the surface, but hostile and resistant underneath. Like black slave students vary in their awareness of what's going on. Some recognize their own put-on for what it is, and even let their rebellion break through to the surface now and then. Others, including most of the good students, have been more deeply brainwashed. They swallow the bullshit with greedy mouths. The honest-to-God believe in grades and busy work and general education requirements. They're pathetically eager to be pushed around. They're like those old gray-headed house inward. You can still find in the South who don't see what all the fuss is about because Mr. Charlie treats us real good. O'Reilly's use of Hassan's question is prompted by a growing cynicism in her own teaching, one similar to Farber's, but directed at teachers, not students, and her sense that young people in the profession know rather little about the history of what, to some of us in mid-career, is still the new pedagogy. The new pedagogy she speaks of is loosely the student-centered classroom and discussions of power relations in the classroom. Pedagogies that look to give up power, or some of it. Pedagogies that agree with many of labor-based grading contracts' basic assumptions. Pedagogies that look to change the rules of the pedagogy game, yet ironically left the rules of the grading game the same. Changing the rules of grading to use labor as with labor-based grading contracts shows us that in writing classrooms, power can move not through standards and teachers' judgments of student writing, although teachers still judge writing, but through students' own labors. These conditions that I believe are fairer for racial, linguistically diverse students, open the writing classroom to ask similar questions that Hassan and O'Reilly do. And they start by giving standards controlled, give up standards give us standards controlled by teachers, So do standards then in English writing classrooms kill people? Maybe a better question is this. In a world of police brutality against black and brown people in the US, of border walls and aggressive and regressive and harmful immigration policies, of increasing violence against Muslims, of women losing their rights to control their own bodies, of overt white supremacy, of mass shootings in schools, of blatant refusals to be compassionate to the hundreds of thousands of refugees around the world, where do we really think this violence, discord, and killing starts? What is the nature of the ecologies in which some people find it necessary to oppress or kill others who are different from them, who think or speak or worship differently than them? All of these decisions are made by judging others by our own standards and inevitably finding others wanting, deficient. People who judge in these ways lack practices of problematizing their own existential situations. They lack an ability to sit easily with paradox. They lack the ability to feel how compassionate an act is of judgment that puts aside one's own standard, one's own habitus, in order to try to approximate the habitus of another. I don't mean to suggest that there are not some cases where a person is simply mentally ill or an anomaly, the exceptions to the norm. I'm saying that there are far fewer cases than we may realize of the exceptions. Every killing is not an exception. Put together, they make the rule. If literacies are bound up not just with communication, but with our identities and the social formations that people find affinity with, if literacy is bound up with how we understand and make our worlds, if literacies are bound up to our own habitus, our habits and dispositions, our values and expectations of others, then a world where literacy classrooms use singular standards to determine progress and grades of locally diverse students, a world that holds every student in the classroom to the same white standard of literacy, regardless of who they are or where they came from or what they hope for in their lives, is a world that tacitly provides and validates the rationales and logics of white supremacy. A world that validates the use of a dominant habitus to make all kinds of judgments and decisions about people elsewhere outside of school. Pardon the bluntness, but conventional grading, the conventional grading game, the standards-based grading game, creates people who kill other people. Our students learn how to judge their world by the practice of judgment they experience. Experiencing standards over and over in classrooms validates by repetition the practice. If standards are always applied and people are ranked based on them, if people are denied things because of them in dispassionate ways through the first 12 or 16 years of one's life, the crucial literacy learning years, then I think it is easier to justify judging everyone, no matter the subject or decision, circumstance or situation, by a single standard unproblematically. And those judgments lead, if one pushes the logic far enough, to violence and killing. So, how do we assess literacy so that people stop killing each other? Change the rules of the grading game. Changing our grading practices encourages grading ecologies that can interrogate more honestly the problem of grading locally diverse students, the paradox of teachers who are by necessity steeped in a white racial habitus, while many of their students are not. The problem of how to help students and teacher confront and discuss bravely the racialized politics of language and its judgment in front of them and between them. Yes, we can confront such paradoxes in the judgment of language, in our habitus, then maybe some of the killing will stop. O'Reilly concludes her article saying, the point is you can't just put your chairs in a circle and forget about the human condition. This human condition is implicated in any classroom where a group of locally diverse or homogeneous students come together to read, write, and engage. What is more critical to the human condition, as Hannah Arendt reminds us, than work, labor, action? No matter how one wishes to define these terms, they reference people toiling, exerting, struggling, trying, suffering, succeeding, failing. They reference making and historicizing building for others, not just for ourselves. Laboring, which may be a good synonym for suffering in the college classroom, is quintessentially the human condition. Maybe this is all flimsy evidence for my claims. Maybe you can find a way to grade by a single standard without reproducing white language supremacy and not protect white literacy as property. Maybe you can grade by a standard without whitening the dike. Maybe changing the grading game to use labor is not enough for you to give up your standard-based grading practices. Maybe it is all too much, too radical, too anti-white supremacist for you. If so, you might ask yourself why. Why stick with a system that so clearly fails so many in such a strong direction? Why not be uncomfortable for a time for your students' sake? Because a school or a program tells you to use a grade or a standard? Them schools. Who are you obligated to? A school? To yourself? To your students? What about the lesson at Thoreau's Civil Disobedience and Walden? Are you not willing to live your grading life deliberately? Or do you prefer to live a teaching life in classrooms of quiet desperation? If enough of us change the rules of the grading game, maybe we might stop some of the killing And that is a social justice project I cannot turn my back on. Can you? Thank you. The question is, how do students respond to labor-based grading contracts? So I've used grading contracts in various forms for the last 15 or so years in three different institutions, 4 different institutions. All but one of those institutions were predominantly not white institutions. One was a historic Hispanic-speaking institution, which was Fresno State. Another was mostly African-American institution, SIUE, Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, and then the one I'm at now, which is in Tacoma, UW Tacoma. So I have found in those places that most students that I teach, and when I say most, I mean at least 8 out of 10, are willing to go along with the contract and find that it helps them in the class and prefer it in writing classrooms, because those are the questions that we asked programmatically. Like, do you prefer it? Does it help you in your writing? And so forth. So we have found that is the case. The ones who initially, and I'm saying initially, this is when I used hybrid versions. That is, I used not a pure labor-based, but labor up to a B, and then if you wanted the high grade, the A category, you had to demonstrate some quality based on judgments. In those cases, it was the conventionally high-performing students. They tended to be in my classrooms. I think it must have been based on the classes I was teaching at the time, these first-year writing classes at the time. They tended to be white females, because they were the ones that had a habitus that was most closely related to the ones that were most valued in their previous English classrooms. My best anecdote for this is one student. She was really a good student, and she came to my class. She was struggling in the class. I could see the frustration in her face in class in our conversations, because we weren't doing the kind of talk that she was used, which is, how do you get the A? Because there was no A to get, right? But now remember, this is a hybrid version, so there still kind of was at the end. And she came to my office afterwards in the middle of the semester, and she said, she literally starts like this: Dr. Inoue, can we stop the circus? Those were her words. Can we stop that? And I said, whoa, circus? What do you mean? So what she meant was that she thought the class was total chaos. She did not, and the reason she did is because the ground was just taken out from underneath her. She had no way to know. She was so used to being validated by grades from teachers that she didn't know how to be the best student in the room. The thing is that what she was really asking for, come to find out, was, how do I do the least amount of work for the most amount of grade? Right? Because that's what she was able to do, because she was rewarded for being herself, which is a wonderful thing in life, to be rewarded for being yourself, right? But that wasn't what my class was about, right? It was about, we're all gonna work hard, because that's what you do when you learn. You want to work, we have to work hard. So those are the standards we're going to set for ourselves. Standards about labor, not standards about my perceptions of your quality of work, of the product. Since then, in pure labor-based, I get none of those questions. That is, I don't get anyone coming to me asking me to stop the circus. Instead, what we get are conversations about, well, why do we want to change it in this classroom? What are my own goals about this class that I can have that fit this? And occasionally, not very often, I would say maybe once every 2 years, maybe, I get a student or two who says, this isn't the class for me, I need to be graded. And I say, okay, I don't want to force anybody to take a class they don't want to take, right? But I do let them know, hey, give me the same amount of faith you give in the teachers that aren't questioning your notions about how to grade and how to progress in a class. Just give me the same respect. I've done research on this. And in the contract, the first 2 pages, the preamble of it, that explain the philosophy and theory behind it, I provide just a little bit of that research in a light way, because it's not meant to be an academic article, but it's meant to be, well, I'm not doing this blindly, and I'm not, a kind of, kumbaya, a hippie, blah, blah, blah. That's not my persona. But I do want to know there is research behind this. I'm not doing this blindly. And we're going to talk about it, negotiate it, and we're going to come up with our contract together. Yes, good question. So you're asking about how institutions have responded to labor-based grading contracts. And I'm thinking you're thinking programmatically, right? Like, So at the last place and the place I'm at, we have programmatically instituted labor-based grading contracts in one course in the stretch sequence. So our first-year writing students have a choice. They can choose the stretch sequence, two semesters or 2 quarters. At Fresno State, it was 2 semesters. Here, it's 2 quarters. Or they can choose the single course, which was the one that was existing before I got there. So half choose the stretch and half choose the single course. And so the first course in that stretch is mandatory by how we passed it through Senate and everything. It's got to be using a grading contract, and it's a pass-fail or credit, no credit. The course after that is a graded course, but you can use a grading contract, but we don't demand that of all teachers. It turns out that about 80% of the teachers who start using it end up using it. That's the same rate at Fresno State. Did it. Because they preferred the system. So in that context, I'll use Fresno State as an example. So when we did this, we got questions about grade inflation and, well, how do we, the conversation started this way in a faculty senate meeting. Gen Ed professor said, I get all these students, I've got a class of 200, and I've got to assign a paper, so I gotta be very careful with it, but I get these papers and my students can't write. And you're the director of the writing. You're supposed to, and you're giving away grades with this grading. I know the grading contract. I've read some of this, and he was quite informed about what grading contracts were. I said, well, what are we talking about here? Like, how pervasive is this problem? I said, how many people do you have in your class? He said, about 200. I said, how many students are we talking about where you having these deep problems with their literacy? He said, about like 6. And I said, sounds like most of your students are doing just fine. And so you can maybe funnel your efforts to those 6 students who might need more help. So what we did then, after that didn't solve the problem. What I did was I took the grade distributions of every college and department at Fresno State for the last year, including our writing program, and just simply displayed them. And what it turns out was that no, it did not change the grade distribution of our program to look any different than any other department or program, except for 3 exceptions, but I'll talk about 2 of them because there's 2 that are the same. But the 2 exceptions were the business department, the business college, the College of Business, and the Honors College. The business college had a bell curve. It was the best bell, and given the nature of the business college, we know exactly why that was. Those are the expectations and assumptions that the professors went into those courses having at that place, because of the nature of the folks that worked there and the kind of research they did and what their assumptions were going into any group population that they might be looking at or studying. So they get bell-shaped distributions. Everyone else had slopes, more A's and B's and C's and fewer D's, F's, and withdrawals. So it would look like this, right? Same with our writing program. The Honors College, however, in the year that we did this study, gave out 1 B and everything else was A's. And I said, if you're looking for grade inflation, so look at the Honors College. Now, nobody was complaining about the Honors College having problems with their grades, right? And I argue the reason is you have very different assumptions about who those students are and where they come from, what they're doing. So you don't question the A in an honors class, but you'll question the grade here. I said, I'd rather think that if there's A's or B's, that means there's some good teachers and good students. The students are doing work and teachers are doing a good job helping them through that work. That may not be always the assumption. So I think we'd have to examine the assumptions we make about how we're coming to conclusions about that. But that has been, and after that, there's been no questions about it. Both students always seem to prefer the grading contract in every place I've been, and there have been no real serious arguments against, that is, there's never been a threat for this to go away. In fact, if anything, there's been more interest in finding out more about how to do them in particular disciplines or in classes that have certain content that might, like a chemistry class, that might have also some objective tests that they have to give, and so forth. So then there's some hybrid versions that might be usable, or some workarounds that we don't really usually have to worry about in humanities classes or literature classes. What was my response to students' resistance, in particular this one about stopping the circus? Well, we talked through the contract and its philosophy, and said this is the assumption in our class. It's just that you've never had to have this assumption. So the rules change for you, right? And so I usually, well, now I think I've found ways that I don't have this privately. It's now a class conversation. I'll usually draw on the board or show a slide that has a bell curve and a triangle. And the triangle is like a pyramid, right? And I say, like, where were you on this bell curve distribution in high school? Right? So like in terms of your writing. And they'll go, oh, well, honors class, A and B. Of course it was. You're in college. Those are the kind of requirements to be here for most people. So now you take that slice and now you have to make a new distribution over it, right? Do you want me to grade that way? Like, that's the standard that you want? Now you're grading against your peers who are also A students in high school. The problem is, of course, that those who get those were at the top of that pyramid. Everybody else is down at the bottom fighting for the scraps or whatever's left over. And so now that it feels like I've just turned this triangle upside down, it feels like everybody can get, because initially they would say, like, so that person can do crappy work and turn in a crappy paper, and I turn in a really great paper, and we get the same grade? And I say, we're not doing grades, but maybe. How much labor did you do, right? It's the labor that matters. So it's just a different mindset. And we train ourselves in the first week or two to understand what it really means for us as people in an ecology to behave differently when we start to really value labor. I know from firsthand experience that students want their labor valued. I mean, I'm sure we've all gotten that meeting with a student who was disgruntled for a grade, and they came and one of the things they said to you after they didn't understand why they got the grade was, but I worked so hard on this paper. And now I'm telling you, work hard, and you get rewarded for that. Like, that's it. That's all you gotta do. I will trust you. And it does require different kind of trust in the classroom. So I have to trust that if my students say I did this work, I spent 2 hours reading, or I did this thing, I gotta trust them. Just like in conventional systems, you have to trust that they're not plagiarizing and turning in something from Wikipedia. Now, maybe sometimes we don't do that. And I think that's a problem as well. That's a different set of problems, but it's a problem, it stems from the same issue, right? Why do we not trust our students? Because they've cheated in the past, or we've known some? What I know about brain research is that our brains are more finely tuned to negative feedback. Something negative in our, because that triggers the flight mechanisms to save our lives, right? The saber-toothed tiger that we see or the whatever it is, right? But our brains still work the same way. So we get to see the negatives. There were 6 students in the classroom who somehow we can't read their writing because they don't have the skills yet to be able to do this work that we're asking them to do, and we think that's the problem. God, we got this pervasive problem. You don't really have a problem. We don't. What we have is simply a moment to shift our paradigms or shift our perspective on what we're valuing in this space. And students have to do the same kind of shifting. They got to learn, oh, my labor can be valued? And that takes some work in the classroom, but not as much as one would think. More students are willing. Yeah, thank you. That's a really great, yeah, problematizing rubrics and our expectations around them. Well, I love rubrics because they're so coic. If you tech writers might know what that is. Clear only if known, right? So because like you have a what's a good one? Say you have a dimension on a rubric about using evidence to support one's claims. Maybe it's relevant and sufficient evidence, clear evidence. Well, what the heck is clear? I mean, that's what's clear to me or relevant to me may not be to you, or maybe that's what I'm trying to do is show you how this is relevant to you, and you're not seeing it. And if you're not able to have that perspective, so my rubrics are very different now, and they changed dramatically because of that. But it's always good to look at others outside of my classroom because they're a little easier to problematize only because my rubrics are dimension-based rubrics instead of standards-based rubrics. Standard-based rubrics then will embody that. But it also is, I mean, all you gotta do is say, what does that look like? What's the model in your head? Yeah. What's that? And my follow-up question is the one that I ask students to take outside of class and come back with is, show me what you think that looks like. That is, what's the ideal in your head? And without giving them any other instruction, you can find these historical examples and then do some demographic research. Who are these people? Where do they come from? Where do they fit racially, gender, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we can start to begin to see some how the habitus gets reinforced and reinforced, right? I always give the example of the writer that I tried to frame myself after in my early years in college was E.B. White. How ironic his name is E.B. White, isn't it? I mean, and I still think he's a wonderful writer, and I still find his work really, really good. But E.B. White is very white, right? But even I had a difficult time. I'm colonizing myself doing this work, and that's not to denigrate any of the fine work that E.B. White did, even though I'm not a fan of Strunk and White. Not a fan. That is the most problematic text. Although maybe good to use in a class like that where you're looking at rubrics and to understand standards and problematizing them. But yeah, so I like to offer that as an example. Say like, what's your E.B. White? Which is the thing? What's that author? And see how it matches up to your history. I've never even lived or been on the East Coast in that Northeast area. And he was in Maine most of his life, right? I don't know. I know nothing about his life, and yet I think I want to be, which I never could be. He's asking about whether there's a collection of resources that I have or can provide for folks who are interested in things like grading contracts, templates of that, and such. Yes. And in fact, I have made a special collection just for you all at this school, but you have to get it at the workshop. But although the handout has links to it for these resources, and that has a URL, and it can be shared after the workshop to the university, and folks can feel free to plagiarize, use it, change stuff, whatever you want to use. It's going to look pretty overwhelming because of the nature of what I have in it. Labor logs and templates and grading contracts and charters for compassion and other stuff. But I would say start with what you feel like you can start with and then move from there. I didn't have all this fully formed. It took me years of testing and trying things out. And my best collaborators were my students. I used to say, I learned so much from my students every quarter. I really didn't mean that. I now really do mean that. Like my students, and that's only changing my stance in the classroom, really. And I'm not saying I'm perfect at it, but I think having a differently oriented classroom, especially when it comes to grades, I have literally nothing over my students. I do not have a grade over them. They cannot, they can do what they want to do. That is in the sense that they do not have to please me. But they do have to, if I say, I don't understand this part in your paper, what are you doing here with this? Like, tell me about what was going on there, and here's what I was expecting, because this is the move that I tend to see in this kind of a paper. That's the conversation that we have. It's not, so what do you want now? How do I get the A? It's not that. I think that we have to think simultaneously about the micro and the macro perspective. If you want to see, so let's just assume that that's true, that this would disadvantage because they don't have, let's say, the dominant English, right? But there's a problem with that, but I'll get to that in a second. But let's say that that's true. Then what have we done? We perpetuate a system that we know is already unfair. And what we've done really is help this student get by. At what cost also, and never really given that student the choice either. So I'm not saying that there aren't students who say, I want to learn the dominant English in your classroom. I want you to help me with that. If that is their goal, who am I? That was my goal when I was there. But even if I wasn't very critical about what that meant, but who am I to stop? I'm not going to give it to them just as a fact. I'm going to offer them a historicized version of that. We're still going to problematize those things. But if that's what you want to learn, then that's what you, at this moment, and that's what you're prepared to do, then okay. But to the larger question about like, does this prepare? No, I don't. The research doesn't show that. The research doesn't show, for instance, that teaching that, let's pretend we're in a semester system. That 15 weeks of instruction, my instruction, as good as it is, as great a teacher as I am, that I'm changing their 20-year practice of language in 15 weeks. And it's highly disciplinary. And I'm assuming that I even know what discipline or area of civic life they're going to write in or communicate in. I don't know that either. I don't even know what that changes are going to be in 5 or 10 years, right? Andrea Lunsford has liked to say, she's someone in my field of rhetoric composition. She used to say, teaching writing changes about every 6 years, like dramatically. So every 6 years, the needs and purposes and everything you do in that classroom changes dramatically. And I think that's generally true, that we're not doing the same things today that we did a decade ago or even 6 years ago. If that's the case, that's because I think that's how language and the society and people are. We're dynamic and we change and so forth. So the best way I can prepare my students for their future language needs is to give them flexible skills that are rhetorically based and generalizable to the things they're going to do with language, not specific things that, okay, do it this way. So what that's meant for me is questioning judgment. How does judgment happen? How do you judge language? Where do we get our judgments and our assumptions about language from? What do you think works right now? What do you think will work in the next class? How do we know that? And then keep asking those questions. So just like I have to continually ask myself, how am I changing? What are my communication needs today or tomorrow or for this thing or for that next project? So I think that I want to say, yes, that prepares students in better ways than it will. I'd rather have a community with a rich linguistic pool of discourse than a homogenous one. Because like in agriculture, all it takes is one virus and the entire orchard's gone. So the same thing I think applies to language and ideas. All we need is one Donald Trump, and it spoils a lot of stuff. Sorry, I don't mean to make this that kind of political, but I think that's like, all it takes is one kind of change or one kind of affirmation within that. And if the entire discourse is susceptible to it, then it's like a disease.